In the summer of 1683, the fate of Europe trembled on a knife's edge. The Ottoman Empire, still vast and formidable though no longer at its peak, had marched west with one of the largest armies seen in the 17th century. Their destination was Vienna, the proud capital of the Habsburg monarchy and the gateway into Central Europe. For 2 months, the citizens of Vienna endured starvation, ceaseless bombardment, and the slow, suffocating grip of siege. Inside the walls were no more than 15,000 defenders, a mixture of regular soldiers and desperate townsfolk. Outside, perhaps 10 times that number, janissaries in gleaming armor, Sipahi cavalry with curved sabers, Tatar horsemen spreading terror, and laborers digging endless trenches pressed the siege closer with each passing day. The story of Vienna in 1683 is not just the tale of a city under siege. It is a clash of empires, of faiths, of personalities whose ambitions and fears shaped history. And it is also the story of one of the greatest cavalry charges ever witnessed, a thunderous avalanche of horsemen that would sweep down from the hills and change the course of Europe. The Ottoman Empire in the late 17th century remained a colossal presence, stretching from the deserts of North Africa, across the Middle East, and deep into the Balkans. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire whose armies had once been irresistible, yet the days of unbroken conquest under Suleiman the Magnificent were a century behind. The empire now wrestled with stagnation, corruption, and the immense strain of governing such a vast domain. Still, the hunger for glory had not dimmed. Sultan Mehmed IV, who reigned from 1648 to 1687, was a ruler increasingly detached from direct command, preferring the pleasures of the hunt. Real power lay in the hands of his Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. Kara Mustafa was ambitious, brilliant in diplomacy, and ruthless in politics. But he was also arrogant and consumed by the dream of immortalizing his name. For him, nothing less than the conquest of Vienna would suffice. Suleiman had failed there in 1529. To succeed where even the greatest Ottoman sultan had stumbled would make Kara Mustafa not merely a statesman but a legend. He persuaded the sultan that Vienna must be taken, framing the campaign as both strategic necessity and holy war. In truth, it was as much about personal ambition as imperial destiny. Facing this threat was Emperor Leopold I, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire and head of the Habsburg dynasty. In character, Leopold could not have been more different from Kara Mustafa. He was scholarly, deeply pious, and cautious to a fault. He lacked the charisma of a warrior king, and was mocked for his protruding Habsburg jaw, the result of generations of dynastic inbreeding. Yet beneath the unimposing exterior was a man driven by duty to preserve his fragile realm. The Habsburg position in 1683 was perilous. To the west, France under Louis XIV sought to undermine them at every turn. In Hungary, Protestant nobles under Imre Tököly were in open rebellion, welcoming Ottoman support against Habsburg rule. Leopold's own armies were small, and his allies across the German states were slow to mobilize. When word spread that an Ottoman host of more than 100,000 men was marching toward Vienna, panic rippled across Austria. By July, with the enemy drawing near, Leopold fled the city with his court, retreating to safety in Passau. It was a strategic necessity. His capture would have meant immediate surrender, but to the Viennese it looked like betrayal. Leadership of the city's defense fell to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a hardened soldier of iron will. Kara Mustafa's army was a terrifying spectacle. At its core were the janissaries, the elite infantry of the empire, disciplined and feared across continents. Alongside them rode the Sipahis, heavy cavalry loyal to the Sultan. Supporting them were contingents from across the empire, Bosnians, Albanians, and Anatolian levies. But perhaps the most feared were the 40,000 Crimean Tatars. Their role was not in siegecraft, but in devastation. Riding swift steppe ponies, they fanned out ahead of the main army, burning villages, enslaving peasants, and sowing terror. The path to Vienna was marked by fire and smoke, a deliberate strategy to paralyze resistance. On the 14th of July, 1683, the great army encircled Vienna. An ocean of tents stretched to the horizon, a city of silk pavilions and prayer banners. The Ottoman camp itself rivaled Vienna in size, bustling with soldiers, merchants, and camp followers. Kara Mustafa demanded the city's surrender. Starhemberg's reply was defiant. He would fight to the last drop of blood. Kara Mustafa, supremely confident, made his first fatal miscalculation. He had rushed his march and left most of his heavy siege artillery behind. His lighter field guns could not breach Vienna's bastions. Instead, he relied on terror and attrition. He believed starvation and fear would force the city to capitulate quickly, leaving its wealth intact for plunder. Thus began the slow agony of siege. The Ottomans dug zigzagging trenches closer to the walls, shielding their sappers who tunneled beneath the bastions. Their goal was to plant gunpowder charges and blow gaping holes in the fortifications. The defenders countered with their own tunnels, a deadly game of cat and mouse beneath the earth. Life inside the city was hell. Supplies dwindled rapidly. Citizens resorted to eating cats, dogs, even rats. Disease spread in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery killed more than cannon fire. Starhemberg enforced brutal discipline. Any soldier caught asleep on watch was executed on the spot. Women and children labored to repair breaches under constant bombardment, yet morale held fueled by a grim determination that surrender meant slaughter. To communicate with allies outside, Vienna relied on spies and couriers who slipped through enemy lines in disguise. The most famous was Georg Kolschitsky, who spoke Turkish and dressed as an Ottoman soldier. He carried messages that kept hope alive within the walls. At night, defenders launched rockets from St. Stephen's Cathedral, fiery pleas for help visible for miles. The most terrifying struggle was invisible. Beneath the city, Ottoman miners dug ever closer. Viennese engineers listened for the faint vibrations of shovels and picks. They placed drums filled with dried peas on cellar floors. If the peas rattled, it meant the enemy was tunneling nearby. Countermines were dug, leading to brutal skirmishes fought in darkness with pistols, knives, and shovels. On the 4th of September, one massive mine detonated beneath the Berg bastion, collapsing part of the defences. Ottoman troops surged forward, only to be repelled by Starhemberg himself, fighting in the breach. But the pressure mounted. By early September, the garrison was down to only a few thousand fit soldiers. Ammunition was nearly gone. One more great explosion might bring the walls down entirely. By the second week of September, Vienna's situation was desperate. The outer defences were crumbling, and Ottoman sappers prepared a final mine to shatter the inner walls. Starhemberg and his men were exhausted. The city was at the edge of annihilation. All eyes turned to the horizon, waiting for the relief army that had been promised but had not yet appeared. For Kara Mustafa, victory seemed assured. He had already prepared for the triumphal entry into Vienna, dreaming of his name etched in history beside Suleiman's. Yet in his obsession with the city, he had made another grave mistake. He had neglected the hills and forests that guarded the approaches to his vast encampment. There, unseen by his army, salvation was marching. While Vienna clung to survival, frantic diplomacy unfolded across Europe. Emperor Leopold's envoys raced from court to court, pleading for assistance. But the politics of the continent were tangled. France's Louis XIV, ever eager to weaken the Habsburgs, quietly encouraged Ottoman aggression. Many German princes hesitated, wary of committing troops to what seemed a lost cause. The most critical partner was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Bound by the Treaty of Warsaw, signed earlier that year, Poland was obligated to aid Vienna if attacked. Yet obligations on parchment were one thing. The reality of mobilizing an army across hundreds of miles was another. At the heart of the decision stood King Jan III Sobieski, one of Europe's most formidable commanders. To him, the campaign was not merely about treaty obligations. It was about faith, reputation, and legacy. Sobieski had spent his career fighting the Ottomans. He knew their tactics, their strengths, and their vulnerabilities. For him, Vienna was the battlefield where Christendom's fate and his own place in history would be decided. Throughout the summer, an unlikely coalition took shape. Charles of Lorraine led imperial forces. Bavarian, Saxon, and Swabian contingents trudged toward the Danube, papal gold-financed recruitment. And at last, in early September, Sobieski himself arrived with his Polish army after a punishing forced march. All told, the relief force numbered around 80,000 men. They were still outnumbered nearly 2-1 by Kara Mustafa's host. But they had one great advantage: unity of command. At a tense war council, German commanders urged caution, favoring a strategy of cutting Ottoman supply lines. Sobieski dismissed the idea. Delay would mean Vienna's destruction. He demanded decisive battle. The council yielded, and he was given supreme command. For the first time in months, the defenders of Vienna had real hope. Rockets fired from the cathedral were answered by the distant echoes of the approaching army. The city clung on a little longer. The relief army's approach was a logistical triumph. To reach Vienna, they had to cross the dense and hilly Vienna woods. The terrain was steep, the paths narrow, and the Ottomans had left the approaches dangerously exposed. Kara Mustafa, obsessed with his siege, had failed to secure the flanks. From the 6th of September to 11, the coalition painstakingly moved men, horses, and artillery through the forests. Soldiers hacked paths through undergrowth, hauled cannons up ravines, and bivouacked in damp clearings. The effort was grueling, but the element of surprise was priceless. On the night of the 11th of September, the entire Allied army emerged onto the ridges of the Kahlenberg heights, overlooking Vienna and the vast Ottoman camp below. As dawn approached, they could see the city's battered walls, smoke rising from its bastions, and the sea of tents stretched across the plains. At sunrise on the 12th of September, the signal cannon thundered. Mass was held on the ridge. Soldiers knelt in the dew-soaked grass, while priests blessed them. Then, banners unfurled, drums beat, and the greatest battle of the century began. The fight began in the foothills. Imperial and German infantry advanced first, engaging the Ottoman left. Fighting was fierce, a grinding clash of pikes, muskets, and swords. The Ottomans, caught off guard, scrambled to meet the sudden assault. Kara Mustafa was indecisive. He hesitated to pull his elite janissaries out of the siege trenches, still convinced that Vienna's fall was imminent. As a result, his reserves were tied down where they could not influence the battle. All morning and into the early afternoon, the Allies pushed slowly forward. Cannon thundered, smoke drifted through the woods, and bodies littered the slopes. Inside Vienna, exhausted defenders peered from the walls and saw banners fluttering in the distance. For the first time in weeks, hope was stronger than despair. By mid-afternoon, the Ottoman lines were stretched thin. Their morale wavered under relentless pressure. Sobieski, observing from the high ground, recognized the moment. He ordered his cavalry to assemble. The spectacle was extraordinary. Nearly 18,000 horsemen massed along the ridge, the largest cavalry force gathered in a single line in early modern Europe. German cuirassiers formed the wings, but at the center were Sobieski's pride, the Polish Winged Hussars. Numbering about 3,000, the Hussars were among the most feared cavalry in the world. Clad in gleaming armor, lances poised, and most famously, adorned with great wooden frames bearing eagle or swan feathers, they presented a terrifying vision. The wings were said to produce a rustling roar in the wind, amplified by the thunder of hooves. Whether psychological or practical, their effect on the battlefield was undeniable. At approximately 5 o'clock, Sobieski gave the command. With a cry, "God is our protector," the cavalry surged forward. From the ridge, they descended, gathering speed. Hooves churned the earth, lances leveled in unison, banners snapping in the wind. Witnesses later described it as an avalanche of steel, a thunderbolt unleashed upon the plain. The exhausted Ottoman infantry could not withstand the impact. The charge smashed through their lines, scattering men in panic. The janissaries, still entrenched, were too far to intervene. Sobieski himself led at the front, his hussars cutting a swath directly toward the lavish command tent of Kara Mustafa. The Ottoman defense collapsed. What had been an army became a mob in flight. Soldiers threw down weapons, abandoning the siege trenches and camp. Panic swept through the host. The once proud siege turned into a rout. As the cavalry thundered into the heart of the Ottoman camp, defenders from Vienna burst from the gates, attacking in a desperate sortie. The trapped Ottoman soldiers now faced enemies from both within and without. Kara Mustafa fled the field, clutching the sacred banner of the Prophet to prevent its capture. Behind him, his sprawling camp filled with silks, jewels, artillery, and provisions fell into Allied hands. For the starving citizens of Vienna, the Ottoman stores were salvation. For the soldiers of the relief army, it was plunder beyond imagining. The great siege was broken. Vienna was saved. And Europe had witnessed one of the largest and most decisive cavalry charges in history. The evening of the 12th of September, 1683, descended upon a transformed landscape. Where hours earlier the Ottomans had maintained an iron grip on Vienna, now their mighty host lay in ruin. Fires smouldered in the abandoned camp. The groans of the wounded mingled with the triumphant shouts of Allied soldiers. Vienna, battered and starving, had survived. Yet the coalition's victory was not without tension. When Emperor Leopold returned to his liberated capital, he received Jan III Sobieski coolly, almost dismissively. Protocol and dynastic pride stood in the way of open gratitude. The scale of the Ottoman defeat was staggering. Tens of thousands lay dead or captured. Siege equipment, cannons, horses, and immense supplies were lost. The aura of invincibility that had once surrounded the Ottoman war machine was shattered, and with it, the long-held fear that Europe's heart might yet fall under the crescent banner began to fade. For Kara Mustafa Pasha, the consequences were fatal. He had staked everything on Vienna, his reputation, his ambitions, his very life. His errors were undeniable, failing to secure heavy artillery, neglecting the Vienna woods, and underestimating both the defenders and the relief army. He fled to Belgrade, but there was no refuge. In Istanbul, his enemies at court wasted no time. Sultan Mehmed IV could not overlook such a catastrophic failure. On the 25th of December, 1683, executioners arrived at Kara Mustafa's tent. By imperial command, he was strangled with a silk cord, an end both ignominious and symbolic. His head was delivered to the Sultan on a silver platter, a grim reminder of the empire's unforgiving standards. Thus ended the life of the man who dreamed of surpassing Suleiman. Instead, he became a cautionary tale of arrogance and hubris. The Battle of Vienna was not merely a single victory. It ignited a broader counteroffensive. In the years that followed, the Habsburg monarchy, emboldened and supported by a newly formed Holy League, pressed relentlessly against Ottoman positions in Hungary and the Balkans. Cities that had long suffered under Ottoman rule were recaptured one by one. The great fortress of Buda fell in 1686 after a brutal siege. Further victories followed at Mohacs in 1687 and at Zenta in 1697. The tide had turned decisively. For the Ottomans, these defeats marked the beginning of territorial contraction in Europe. No longer would their armies threaten Vienna or the heartlands of Christendom. Instead, they found themselves increasingly on the defensive, struggling to maintain an empire beset by internal and external pressures. The culmination of these campaigns came in 1699 with the Treaty of Karlowitz. After 16 years of war, the Ottomans were forced to cede vast territories to the Habsburgs, including most of Hungary and Transylvania. It was the first major diplomatic concession the empire had ever signed with European powers, and it marked a watershed moment. Karlowitz signaled the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe and the rise of the Habsburg monarchy as a dominant Central European power. It reshaped the political map of the continent, setting the stage for the struggles of the 18th century. The psychological impact was equally profound. The image of the unstoppable Ottoman juggernaut dissolved. Instead, Europe now saw an empire in slow decline, even as its grandeur persisted in Istanbul and its provinces. No great battle is without its legends, and Vienna in 1683 is no exception. Popular tales claim that the croissant, shaped like the crescent moon, was invented by Viennese bakers to celebrate victory over the Ottomans. Others say that coffee, discovered in the abandoned Ottoman camp, inspired Vienna's famous café culture. These stories, while charming, are more myth than fact. Croissants trace their origins to older pastries, and coffee had already been known in Europe before 1683. Yet legends endure because they capture the imagination, embodying the symbolic triumph of one culture over another. The Battle of Vienna has often been portrayed as a clash of civilizations, Christian Europe against the Muslim Ottoman Empire. While faith undeniably played a role, the reality was more complex. Politics, ambition, and personal rivalries shaped decisions as much as religion. France's quiet support for the Ottomans, for example, shows that power politics often outweighed confessional unity. Yet in the centuries since, the battle has become a symbol of resistance and deliverance. For Poland, it immortalized Sobieski as a national hero, a king who rode to the rescue of Europe. For Austria, it marked the beginning of resurgence, transforming the Habsburgs into a major continental power. For the Ottomans, it was the moment when the tide of expansion definitively turned. The echoes of the 12th of September 1683 still resound. Military historians study the coordination of coalition forces, the logistical triumph of crossing the Vienna woods, and the sheer spectacle of the largest cavalry charge in early modern history. For the public, the battle remains a stirring tale of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The Siege of Vienna in 1683 was more than a military contest. It was a crucible of endurance, arrogance, faith, and destiny. Inside the city walls, citizens starved but refused to yield. Outside, an ambitious vizier gambled everything on terror and intimidation. And from the forests came an army of allies who set aside rivalries for a cause greater than themselves. The climax was sudden and unforgettable. 18,000 horsemen thundering down the slopes of Kahlenberg, lances gleaming, wings rattling, sweeping away the mightiest army of the age. In that moment, the future of Europe shifted. The Battle of Vienna reminds us that history often turns on a single day, a single decision, a single charge. It is a story of desperation and salvation, of arrogance undone by resolve, and of how a city on the brink of destruction became the stage for one of the most decisive victories in European history. The thunder of hooves has long since faded, but its echoes remain etched in memory, myth, and the enduring legacy of a battle that saved Vienna and reshaped the world.